Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming this afternoon. I think there are a lot of Catholics in the audience because everyone's sitting far at the back. That's usually an indicator. Welcome to the Ream Library for the McFarland Center's second Global Catholicism themed lecture of 2025. My name is Brent Otto, and I am Global Catholicism Fellow in the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture at Holy Cross. The McFarland Center sponsors an array of campus lectures, discussions, conferences, conversations, and symposia that foster dialogue on questions of meaning, morality, and mutual obligation, as well as initiatives to foster Jewish-Christian understanding and to enhance our understanding of Catholicism from a global perspective. Today, I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Chandra Mallampalli to our campus. Professor Mallampalli joins us from Harvard University's Mittal Institute. He is a historian of modern South Asia, whose research and publishing have focused on the place of Christians in Indian history, particularly where religious and racial identities intersect with colonial law in the public sphere. Professor Mallampalli is the author of 4 monographs and numerous articles. They include Christians in Public Life in Colonial South India, 2006, Race, Religion, and Law in Colonial India, Trials of an Interracial Family, 2011, A Muslim Conspiracy in British India, Politics and Paranoia in the Early 19th Century Deccan, and most recently, South Asia's Christians Between Hindu and Muslim, 2023. And many of you in the audience have read sections of that latest book. Drawing especially from this latter book, Professor Mallampalli today will speak to us, focusing on the place of Catholics in South Asia's history. Today's talk is a 2025 Deitchman Family Lecture on Religion and Modernity. Professor Mallampalli's lecture is entitled Catholicism in India, Blending In and Staying Apart, 1500 to the Present. He introduces this topic for us with this question: what happens when the world's oldest multicultural organization, the Catholic Church, interacts with one of the most religiously and linguistically diverse regions of the world? It results in a tug-of-war between blending in and staying apart. Using images and anecdotes from a 500-year history, Professor Mallampalli will describe for us the Church's dual tendency to adopt its Indian surroundings while at the same time retaining a sense of distinctiveness and mission. Most of my history students, Chandra, are in Christianity and colonialism this semester. They're here in the audience today, and they have read your chapters on the Thomas Christians as well as the Jesuit mission at the Mughal court. And so I expect at the end, in the question time, they will be forthcoming with some questions for you. Everyone, thank you for joining us this afternoon, and please join me in welcoming Professor Mallampalli.
Thanks so much, Father Otto, for that nice introduction, and really great to be here. It's the first time on your campus, really beautiful campus. I'm definitely glad this is an indoor lecture, a cozy, warm place like this. As has been stated, the title of my talk is Catholicism in India, Blending In and Staying Apart. And I suppose one way you can frame a talk like this is to think about a relationship between two parties coming together. It's a relationship that has a history of conflict, but it has a history where both sides are shaping each other. And so both sides are changed in some way by the encounter. And we'll be taking a look at different aspects of the relationship between Catholicism and India with some anecdotes and zooming in on a few different people. First, take a look at the Catholic side of the relationship. Catholicism is known to be highly diverse. It's a global religion, a tradition that goes back millennia. Even from its very beginnings, it was transnational, multicultural, multi-ethnic, very much engaged globally, and very committed to adapting itself to whatever surroundings it finds itself in. So this is adaptive element to Catholicism. I'm going to be talking about the Jesuit tradition a little bit and a principle called accommodatio, accommodation, the attempts of Jesuit missionaries to adapt to their cultural surroundings. And that is very much a part of the narrative of the Catholic Church worldwide. Very much a transnational, multicultural organization. This is a quote from a historian named John McGreevy. "No institution is as multicultural or multilingual as the Catholic Church. Only Catholicism counts for 1.2 billion baptized members, a majority of whom are people of color living in the global South." That's quite an extraordinary reference that he begins his book with. So you flip to the India side of the relationship, and you'll see that we're not talking about an organization, we're talking about a region of the world, a subcontinent. Actually, India should not even be thought of as a country. It's really a very huge landmass, like the size of Europe. So it ought to be about 8 to 15 different countries. That's the way you should think about India, because every region you go has a different language, has a different television station, different programming. It's a very huge landmass extending into the Indian Ocean. And you can tell, if I can get this pointer to, you can tell that this landmass is really connected to other parts of the world. It's connected to the east coast of Africa, to the Arabian Peninsula, to Persia and China through the Silk Roads, to Southeast Asia. And so India cannot help but to be engaged with the world, just like Catholicism is super engaged with the world. India is home to the great religions of the world: Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam. We tend to associate Islam with the Arabian Peninsula, but there are actually more Muslims in South Asia than in the Middle East. There are more Muslims in South Asia than there are in Indonesia. People think Indonesia is the highest population of Muslims in the world. Actually, it's not the case. So it's a very, very extraordinary place to study. I think Brent and I both consider ourselves privileged to be studying this region of the world. So the question is, how do we understand this region of the world? Well, sometimes we have to deal with metaphors. They're very helpful for understanding India. And these metaphors are useful up to the point. Then you got to say, well, is this a friendly metaphor or is this not so friendly of a metaphor? So I've got three for your consideration. The first is to think of India as a sponge. And this is an Orientalist, a European way of talking about India. It's a region of the world that absorbs. It absorbs influences. Other people come to India. The Persians have come to India. Greeks, Jews, Afghans, even Chinese have come to India, settled there. And over time, they get absorbed into this extraordinary curry. And that may sound like a wonderful image, but there's something that is somewhat violent about the sponge image, meaning, do you lose your identity when you get absorbed? So I'll just leave it at that for that particular image. The other image I want for you to consider is the image of a honeycomb. Now, that sounds a little bit more palatable than a sponge. It sounds sweet. But what you have in a honeycomb is what? You have different compartments. So people come in from the outside, Jews in diaspora, the Parsis from Iran, Afghans from Central Asia. They come into India, but then they just get kind of enclosed in their own spaces. They retain their identity, but they still remain separate from other identities. And that's what you get from that honeycomb image, India as a honeycomb. And a third that I would have you consider is the idea of India as a kaleidoscope. As a kaleidoscope of identities, you look at India and you see practically everything at the same time, but depending on how you shift your lens, everything is constantly shifting. There's something appealing about the kaleidoscope metaphor in the sense that it takes us away from a static picture. So India changes depending on how you look at it, and there's a shifting of the colors and the shapes. So all of these images, and others as well, people have called India a great mosaic of identities, a mosaic of influences, a potpourri of influences. But the question is, what happens when an adaptive transnational faith encounters a culturally complex society like India? What happens when you have missionaries that are coming to a region of the world, they're committed to adapting themselves to that cultural environment? How do they deal with the complexities of a region like this? You can see the image of Roberto de Nobili, the famous Jesuit missionary who developed this idea of accommodation. You can see how he changed his dress so that he looks like a Hindu holy man from an upper caste wearing a saffron robe. And on the right, you see an image of the famous Jesuit missionary to China, Matteo Ricci, who adopted the clothes of a Confucian scholar so that he could effectively reach an audience in the imperial courts of China. But is this adaptation meaningful when you're dealing with a society as complex and layered as India? A big issue that we have to grapple with in the Indian context is the issue of the caste system. So if you think caste is something, it's a hierarchical system of hereditary occupations defined by birth. If you're going to adapt to India, are you going to embrace the caste system? Are you going to embrace the privilege and the hierarchy that comes with that system? The answer that de Nobili gave to that question is yes, we're going to embrace caste for a time being for the sake of Christianization. And maybe we can impact the whole society. But by and large, Catholic missionaries have taken the chameleon approach. They tried to change their color, they changed their cultural complexion to whatever context they found themselves in, but they tried to adapt to one segment of the honeycomb. And the others, well, maybe other Catholics adapted in different ways to those other pieces. Before I get into other material, I want to throw out this question. Isn't it the case that everything adapts? If you stay in a place long enough, you're going to adapt. You're going to start speaking with a Boston accent. You're going to start adopting the idiom and the cultural habits of the region that you stay in long enough. This is a book by a scholar named Lamin Sanneh called Translating the Message. It's about global Christianity. It's about world Christianity and how Christianity became a world religion. And according to Lamin Sanneh, the essence of Christianity is its cultural adaptability and its capacity to become radically pluralistic. It just adapts and translates itself everywhere it goes. And the reason why Christianity can translate itself into all the cultures of the world is because it believes that God translated himself into a human being, into Jesus. And that lays the foundation for the translation of scriptures into every language, every mother tongue of the world. And the translation of the Bible into these mother tongues creates cultural differences in the church. And this is actually a good thing from the standpoint of Sanneh's book, Translating the Message. Sanneh draws a distinction between Christianity and Islam on that point of translation. According to Sanneh, Islam does not have this translatability because according to Orthodox Islam, the Quran cannot be translated out of Arabic. It can never be translated into vernacular language. And if you do that, you contaminate the meaning of divine revelation. And so Islam retains its center in the global map, in the holy lands of Mecca and Medina, and it continues to expand, but it never leaves its center behind. in contrast to Christianity, which is this chameleon-like adaptation to the cultures of the world, but it always leaves its place of origin, and it rises up somewhere else. And that's the distinction that Sane wants to make between Christianity and Islam. When it comes to India, people have pushed back on this idea that Islam is not translatable, because Islam in India is very translated into an Indian form, in Indian indentations. These are a couple books. One by the scholar Niall Green talks about Islam in the city of Bombay, very much adopts the characteristics of Hinduism and the characteristics of the cultural surroundings of that coastal city. This is a book by Sebastian Prang called Monsoon Islam, which talks about the very different form of Islam that you find in South India than what you would find in Saudi Arabia. So there is this morphing of religion. And so there is an adaptability in that as well. What about McDonald's? Does McDonald's adapt? You still got the golden arches. Once upon a time, there might have been one arch, I think, if you go back to the old images of McDonald's. In India, they don't serve Big Macs with beef because cows are venerated in India, and they don't eat beef in India, so they say. I've had a good hamburger in India before. But they serve mutton burgers. So there is an adaptation that was involved in marketing McDonald's to India. What about cricket, the sport of cricket? You cannot be an Indian without following cricket. You can't be from Pakistan without following cricket. Well, did cricket originate in South Asia? No, cricket originated probably in England. And it eventually was appropriated by these other regions. So what exactly is different about the adaptation that was promoted by these early Jesuits when they came to India? And is it something that you try to do, or is it something that just happens? If you stay there long enough, you're just going to start changing. Just kind of like the Aussies, their accents started changing when they're down under. From the 17th century on, suddenly they don't speak English the same way the Brits did, even though they thought of this as their motherland for a long time. Everybody morphs, everybody adapts. So what are we talking about in terms of the story of Catholicism coming to India? I'm going to give you some examples from 3 different periods in India. The period of Portuguese rule, the period of British rule, and the period of independent India. This is an image, a beautiful picture of the Immaculate Conception Cathedral in a former French colony called Pondicherry. I'll tell you a little bit more about this structure in a few minutes. But if I could summarize the whole talk in one sentence, it would be, this is a period of adaptation, of accommodation, of blending in. This is a period of staying apart, and this is a period of being pushed apart. Okay, say that again. This is blending in, this is staying apart, this is being pushed apart. Like that. So how does this work? How does this play itself out? It begins by realizing that Christianity begins in the world of the Mediterranean. And the early church saw the world originally in terms of 3 groups of people. There were Jews, there were Christians, and there were Gentiles. Sometimes you called the Gentiles pagans. The Gentiles were not a single group. It was like everybody who wasn't Jew or Christian was Gentile or pagan. They had many different philosophies, gods and goddesses, subgroups, etc. But they were grouped in that particular way. By the 7th century, that map of the world expands. There are Jews, there are Christians, there are Muslims, and there are pagans. So by the time you get to Columbus's voyage, crossing the Atlantic, discovering the Bahamas, which are followed by the Spanish conquests of Mexico and parts of South America, the establishment of Jesuit missions, of Catholic missions in the New World. By the time you get to this period, you're dealing with a greater world. You're dealing with diversity like you've never seen before, a world beyond the Mediterranean. And that is a huge challenge for Christians. How do you make sense of Amerindians and Asians at the same time? There is a map that was created when you lived inside this Mediterranean world, and when you see a world beyond the Mediterranean, you're tempted to use the same categories to process the reality. So you're either a Jew, a Christian, a Muslim, or you're a pagan. And guess where most of the Amerindians and Asians fell? They were mostly pagans, but there were also Christians in Asia that predated the arrival of the Portuguese and the Jesuits. And there were also Jews in Asia that were scattered after going all the way back to the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD and the Reconquista of the Iberian Peninsula. The Jews were scattered. Some of them settled in India. They stayed there a very long time. So they have to recalibrate that map when they encounter these new places in the world. And the early Jesuits that came to India developed an idea called accommodatio. And it actually has medieval origins. And in the medieval world, the idea of accommodation related to how to translate the language of God into the language of human beings. And that relates to Scripture. Scriptura humanae loquitur. How do you translate and make the Bible, make the language of God meaningful to human beings? Well, you have to adopt some categories of human language that are not in the Bible. If it's going to be meaningful at all, you've got to use the idiom of the multitude. And that's the first instance where Catholics were coming to terms with accommodatio, according to a scholar named Inez Zupanov. Later on, in the context of this discovery of the Americas and the discovery of Asia, accommodatio became a missionary method. How much of the original culture of a non-Christian group of people can you retain in order to Christianize them, in order to draw them into the church? How much can you keep intact? And there is some distinctions that have to be made. Are those cultural practices that you want to preserve consistent with Catholic morals and Catholic doctrine? Okay, if they are neutral, if it's all about clothing, it's just about clothing, there's nothing in the Catholic tradition that militates necessarily about the clothes you wear, well, maybe you should just let them dress the way they do and teach them about the Holy Trinity and the sacraments, etc. And this is how some of these early Jesuits, the Jesuit mission to the Far East, the Jesuit mission to Asia, were thinking about accommodation. You can draw a distinction between religious customs, religious beliefs, and neutral civil practices, where you can just keep the civil practices intact, especially if these pagans are living under their own kings. You don't want to pluck them out, or you don't want to get them to change their appearance and their customs too much, because their kings could end up persecuting them and turning against the Catholic Church as a whole. So that's how accommodatio begins to get developed in India. The first instance of Catholicism in India occurs under the auspices of Portuguese colonial power. The Portuguese were keen on controlling some of the port cities on the west coast of India. There was a very lucrative pepper trade in South India that they wanted to gain access to. There was a lucrative trade in pearls and pearl fishing, and there were communities that were committed to the pepper trade and to pearl fishing. And so they established a capital, a center in a city called Goa, By the way, you should visit Goa sometime. Great beaches, great curried prawns, the best I've ever tasted. Tried to replicate that recipe, never fully succeeded. But the Pope at the time had extended what's called the royal patronage, the padroado, to the Portuguese, basically saying to the Portuguese crown, I'm entrusting you to establish churches in the Far East, appoint bishops, appoint priests, and build churches. And I'm also giving you a green light to go into these regions of the world and use the means at your disposal to advance the Catholic Church. And sometimes those means that they adopted were violent, and they involved the destruction, the wholesale destruction of Hindu temples, and the what you would call a coerced or a forced conversion, meaning if you don't convert to the Catholic Church, there are going to be significant disadvantages if you don't convert. And those were some of the policies that were implemented in Goa. In this early period, when the Portuguese first arrived in India, it was assumed that to become a Christian was to join a community of foreigners. So this is before accommodatio became the big currency in Jesuit practice. Somebody like Francis Xavier and the people working under him, a very famous Jesuit missionary to South India, would approach a person and say, would you like to join the Farangi Kulam, the community of foreigners? Meaning, you join this community of foreigners, you change your customs, you change the way you dress, you change your name, and you disassociate from everything associated with your past religion. And that was the assumption of many of these early missionaries that followed the Portuguese to India. You take people out of their culture and establish them in Portuguese customs and habits and reduce them, meaning bring them back to true civilization. And that was a very dominant position, largely because the early Catholic missionaries were very afraid of mixture, of what's called syncretism. Okay, I like Jesus. Let's put Jesus alongside Vishnu and Shiva and Parvati and all the Hindu gods of the pantheon. Jesus is just going to be one more god that we worship. Francis Xavier says, no, you're not going to do that. Jesus is Lord. Jesus is exclusive. Jesus is the true God, and these are not true gods. And so that exclusiveness inclined people like Francis Xavier to actually conduct tests when people wanted to become Catholic. He would conduct what were called tests of sincerity. Do you really understand what you're trying to do here? We're talking about 10,000 fishermen that wanted to become, 10 or 20,000 fishermen that wanted to become Catholic during Francis Xavier's missionary career in India. So many that he's wondering, okay, maybe they want to join the Farangi Kulam. Maybe they want to join the community of foreigners for the benefits of being associated with foreigners, a better way of life, the material benefits. But do they really understand anything about Catholic doctrine? So he would have to conduct these tests of sincerity before somebody could be administered the sacrament of baptism, and that involved finding out if they could recite the Lord's Prayer. Can you recite any aspect of the Nicene Creed, anything? Do you know anything about what you're doing? And this was the approach until the Catholics began to develop an awareness that you cannot force people to change their customs. It's really hard to get people to change their customs. Something as simple as dress is hugely, hugely significant. So some early examples of accommodation. First of all, there was this myth that circulated in Europe that somewhere out in Timbuktu, somewhere in India, there was a mysterious king named Prester John who was the head of a vast Christian army. And this myth became resuscitated from time to time. It spread and circulated in Europe in the 12th century. There's what you call the letters of Prester John. Somebody wrote these letters of this king who had a kingdom and an army somewhere in India. Now, why was this an absolutely captivating, attractive idea to Catholics in Iberia? Well, this is a time when you have rising Muslim power in Europe. You have something called the Ottoman Empire. And you also have the Mughal Empire a little bit later. So Muslims are becoming very prominent in the lands to the east of Iberia. And they're impinging on European lands. So the idea was, well, if we can find the lost kingdom of Prester John somewhere in India, we can outflank the Muslims and actually, once and for all, lay claim to the Holy Land and lay claim to all the holy sites of the Catholic Church without any fear of molestation from Muslim enemies. Well, when they got to India, they found that there were some Hindu kings that actually wanted to become Christian so that they could enjoy the protection of the Portuguese. And they could enjoy the military support of the Portuguese. There was one king, the king of Tanur, who became a Christian. He came from the highest caste of India called the Brahmin caste. One of the customs of that caste is to wear a sacred thread. And he said, I want to become a Christian, but because I'm a king, and because I'm in this region that has these customs, I don't want to cut my sacred thread off. And I want to retain my high caste status, and I want to retain my entourage and my ceremonies. And basically, the missionaries in Goa said, we kind of need him to become Christian, but we don't want to rock the boat too much, so let him keep a lot of his customs. That was the first instance of accommodatio in India, is just letting this king become a Christian on his own terms and to keep a lot of his own stuff. But some of the Jesuits started saying there's something disingenuous about this. First of all, he only wants to become Christian so that he can enjoy Portuguese backing. And the other thing is there's something duplicitous about him wanting to please this Hindu audience, but also wanting to be a part of the Catholic Church. And so it seemed a little bit like identity concealment. I'm going to become Christian, but I'm secretly going to practice all of my old culture so I can enjoy the prestige that comes from being a part of this old nobility. And it's the same kind of identity concealment that is observable in Spain during a period called the Reconquista, when the Catholic armies tried to reclaim the Iberian Peninsula from Jews and Muslims. And Jews were forced to convert to Catholicism or to be executed or to just be sent out of Spain. And some Jews converted to Catholicism, but there was this lingering suspicion that they were secretly practicing their old Judaism, their old habits. And so you got this identity concealment thing going on in India as well. Now, getting back to Prester John, are they going to find a Christian army and a Christian community in so-called India? By the way, India didn't just mean the India I'm talking about. India also meant Ethiopia. So there was an African Prester John. Matter of fact, the images of Prester John were the images of an African man. But India, back in the day, was everything out east. That included the east coast of Africa and the Indian subcontinent and other parts of Asia. It was a big India. And so when they got to the real Indian subcontinent, they encountered an old tradition called the Thomas Christians, an old ancient Christian community called the Thomas Christians. Now, how did these folks hang around? For 1,500 years, legend has it that the Thomas Christians were established by Jesus' apostle Thomas. Yes, feel my hands and feel my side. I'm really the resurrected king. is that really you? I can't believe you until I get in there and he's just doing this, you know. Okay, Doubting Thomas, according to legend, made a trip, was tricked into going to India. He goes to India and he makes some converts in a number of places along the coasts of India. And this community hangs around all the way until the arrival of the Portuguese in India. And the Portuguese, when they find the Thomas Christians, think they have found the lost kingdom of Prester John. And they think these Thomas Christians are going to be our allies in our competition against the Muslims. And they look at the Thomas Christians and they think, wow, you have apostolic origins. We trace our lineage to Peter, and you trace your lineage to Thomas. I bet we can get along. I bet you could be brought in. I bet you can be reduced and brought into the Catholic fold so that we're all under the authority, the apostolic authority of Peter. But they looked carefully at the Thomas Christians and they noticed two things. Number one, they got some funky beliefs. And they got some customs that don't line up with the customs of the Latin Church. They practice the Syriac rite, not the Latin rite. And they have a theology that is referred very pejoratively to as Nestorianism. They are Nestorian heretics. Now, what is the big shtick about Nestorianism? It has to do with an emphasis on the humanity of Jesus. Nestorius got into a big tiff in the early church about the nature of Christ, and he said, okay, Jesus was divine, but let's not forget that he was a human being and that he is totally human. Anyway, the conclusion that Nestorius came to was very different from Cyril of Alexandria, who said, no, Jesus is not two distinct persons in one body. He's a complete fusion of divine and human, a hypostasis. This minute little distinction became the basis for designating anyone in these Oriental churches as a heretic, as a Nestorian heretic. And so the Thomas Christians were not only immersed in their culture and habits, which were very different from those of the Portuguese and the Latin Christians, but they also had an aberrant theology. And not only that, the Thomas Christians were in control of the pepper trade in many of the most lucrative farm districts of the interior of the Malabar coast. So the Portuguese Jesuits learned two things from them. Number one, these folks adapted. They hung around for 1,500 years. They accommodated. We could learn principles of accommodation by just looking what the Thomas Christians did in becoming a part of this landscape in India. And they eventually adapted. They developed their ideas about cultural accommodation by looking at what the Thomas Christians did. These are some images of the Portuguese of the Thomas Christians. And you notice that there is a racialization of the Thomas Christians. They're portrayed as being very dark-skinned. They weren't always dark-skinned. But they're also portrayed as having the capacity to become Portuguese-looking. So these are women who are wearing Western clothes. This is a Portuguese nobleman proposing in marriage to some women who have been converted to Catholicism and entered the community of foreigners and changed their dress. And this is a representation of the Thomas Christians. The caption up here reads, Malabarese made Christian by the well-ventured St. Thomas, dating from 1540. Okay. So moving right along, this is the chapter that many of you have read. This is another venue where Jesuits had to adapt to a context. This is the Jesuit mission to the courts of Akbar. And you'll recall that Jesuits were very captivated with power, with influence, and they were very much enamored by the trickle-down theory that if you can convert the person at the top, like the emperor and the nobility. It's going to trickle down and have an impact. You can end up Christianizing the whole empire, the whole region of the world. So the India was controlled by the Mughal Empire in the 16th century, and there was this extraordinary historical figure called Akbar, who was the emperor, and the Jesuits made 3 different missions to the courts of Akbar. And one of the reasons that they're able to make 3 missions is that Akbar himself had a voracious appetite for spiritual dialogue. He enjoyed talking about theology with the Jesuits, and they engaged him. And I don't know if you have any opportunity to write an essay in any of your classes that requires primary sources, but you can get all the letters that the Jesuits sent back to Rome that are translated into English that record their encounters with the Mughal Emperor Akbar. They're absolutely fascinating. And I built that chapter around those letters. What's interesting about this space that they enter is that it was a very argumentative space. This is a place Akbar said, I want members of all the religions to come to my court and engage in peaceful dialogue about religion. But the dialogue wasn't terribly peaceful. Matter of fact, it was often so intense that it was on the brink of breaking out into violence. And the Jesuits were part of the problem because they adopted a very aggressive, argumentative style, especially when they encountered Muslims in Akbar's court. They would criticize openly the Prophet Muhammad. They would say that they have a completely twisted understanding of the Bible. Many things that were actually going beyond a theological kind of engagement. And the Muslims would get so angry because the Jesuits were actually quite good at argument. That was part of their training, is to learn how to argue with members of other religions, learn how to argue with Protestants. The Jesuits believe that Akbar is on the cusp of becoming a Christian, but they never see him become a Christian. And the 2 things that he's ultimately not able to swallow is I cannot swallow the idea that God could become a human being. Can't go there. And the other thing he says is, I cannot understand how God could be 1 and also 3. And so these were the sticking points of Akbar's, is why he was never able to make the decision to become baptized as a Christian, as the Jesuits had hoped he would. But what you get from these letters of the Jesuit mission to Akbar are some really interesting case studies in adaptation, because these folks learned Persian, and most of their conversations were in Persian. And Akbar was so open-minded, he said, look, I'm going to hire some court artists. I want you to sit down with these artists and teach them how to represent the Virgin Mary in the Mughal way, teach them how to represent, to produce Christian art. So the Mughal Empire has a lot of Christian art and Christian architecture because of this extraordinary encounter between Akbar and these Jesuit visitors to his palace. Another example of blending in. So this is the most famous advocate of cultural adaptation, a Jesuit by the name of Roberto de Nobili. You can see that he's seated in the lotus position. You probably know about yoga and meditation, and he's seated in a lotus position. He's wearing a sacred thread. This is such a terrible print. I wrote all over the world to find the original, where this came from. Everybody came up empty-handed. But he's seated in a lotus position. He's wearing a sacred thread around his torso. His hand is lifted, and he's signaling something in a Hindu gesture. And he's wearing a saffron-colored robe and something to cover his head. Robert de Nobili said, I come from the Brahmin caste of Rome. What on earth is that supposed to mean? There's no caste in Rome. Well, there is a hierarchy in Rome. I come from the Brahmin caste of Rome, and I'm going to reach out to the Brahmins, because Paul said, I'm going to become all things to all people in order to win the many. To the Brahmins, I become a Brahmin, the highest priestly caste. This is an image of the Sri Meenakshi Sundarveswara temple in Madurai in South India in the background. And here you see a Hindu seated in a meditative posture, having a dialogue with Roberto de Nobili. This became a classic example of accommodatio, and it gets de Nobili in trouble. Who does it get him in trouble with? Not immediately with the Pope, but with other Catholic orders, like the Franciscans. The Franciscans were much more loyal to the Portuguese, were much more committed to doing things in a Latin sort of a way, and bringing people into the Catholic fold and asking them to abandon some of their old culture. And so there was one Franciscan in particular, his name was Gonsalves, I believe, that really called out de Nobili, said, you're crossing over way too much. You never mention the Roman hierarchy in any of your discussions with the Hindus. You never mention the church. It's all about you and them. It's not about the world that you belong to. It's almost like you're ashamed of that world. You're crossing over way too much. And then you're adopting things that are not just civil practices, they're actually religious practices. And so you're mixing things up. They more or less accused de Nobili of a doctrinally problematic syncretism, a mixture. And so this gives rise to what are referred to as the rights controversies in Malabar, where it goes to Rome. Is it okay for this guy to wear saffron-colored robe? Is it okay for him to wear that sacred thread and to smear ashes on his forehead, which represents being, consciousness, and bliss in the Hindu tradition? Is it okay for him to spend all his time learning Sanskrit and arguing with the vocabulary of Hindu philosophy instead of arguing with Thomistic categories? And initially, Rome said, I think it's okay. I think it's okay. I'm going to give him the green light. But 1 century later, a decree was passed in 1712 by Pope Clement, I believe, saying no more of these accommodations. It's gone way too far, because it's not just de Nobili that was doing it. It was his successors, including Constanzo Beschi, who actually was a brilliant human being, learned Tamil literature, produced Catholic poetry in Tamil literary categories, Tamil literary forms, was absolutely amazing in what he was able to do. A fantastic book by Margarita Trento about Constanzo Beschi. But the examples I just gave you are of people trying to reach the elites, people trying to deploy their intellectual capabilities to reach to the intellectuals of these other societies. But Catholicism in India was much more grassroots in terms of how it expressed itself. This is the corpse of Francis Xavier. This is his actual body. Every 10 years, they make this available to the public. And just several months ago was the 10 years, and they make this corpse available. He's missing a right arm, which was sent back to Rome. And he's also missing his little toe, which was bit off by a devotee wanting to get as much blessing as possible, apparently. But every 10 years, thousands of Catholics come to look at the remains of Francis Xavier, believing that there are some miraculous powers associated with his person, even his posthumous person. And this is one of the characteristics of devotional Catholicism, popular devotional Catholicism, is that it adopts many of the categories and motifs of popular devotional Hinduism and popular devotional Sufism. I'm not saying the content is the same, but I'm saying the form is the same, because the most important personality in Hindu society is the wandering world renouncer, who renounces the world, renounces material possessions, denies the body, commits himself to a life of celibacy. And through this life of self-denial and self-effacing, even the willingness to become a martyr, that person acquires some sort of divine power. Power to heal, power to cast spirits out of people. And people assigned all of these attributes to Francis Xavier and to Francis Xavier's body and to any kind of shrine to Francis Xavier, that going there can cure problems of infertility, going there can cure illnesses, and this is something that is very much a part of popular devotional Catholicism. But is this accommodatio? Not necessarily. This is just adaptation that happens in India, and you see a parallel in the history of Muslims in South India. They're all following into these categories, these slots that are created by the culture. And I'll give you one last image, and that is female deity veneration and spirit possession. Now, in the West, to be possessed by a spirit is inherently problematic. You've got to get it exorcised, and it's a bad thing. But in Hindu tradition, it was something good if the spirit chose to actually inhabit you, if a female divinity chose to inhabit you. It was a blessing, and it also gave a person special powers to cast lower spirits out of people and to perform acts of healing and to expel disease from other people. Now, in South India, there is a great tradition among Catholics to have Marian celebrations and Marian devotion, but you also have the phenomenon of Marian possession. And this is very well documented in a recent book by Kristen Bloomer, maybe not so recent, maybe 2020 or something, where you have several women, but one in particular, who claims to have been possessed by the Virgin Mary herself. And that person displays the holy stigmata. That person actually counsels people when she is being being a medium to the voice of the Virgin Mary, and is also able to pray for people and their sicknesses. And thousands of people flock to this person in Tamil Nadu. So these are other instances of adaptation in the South Indian context, in addition to the classical elite examples that I gave you of Robert de Nobili and Constanzo Besci. But I'm going to stop there, and we'll save the rest for discussion.